Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. Today we're doing a checkup on our mental health, discussing how professionals in the nonprofit sector are coping with the stresses and challenges in the workplace and what nonprofit leaders can do to support their well-being. We're speaking with Caroline Kealey, an internationally recognized expert in change leadership and communications. She is the founder and principal of the Results Map. Her practice in change leadership and communications includes supporting the Asian Development Bank, the United Nations, the House of Commons, and several universities and research institutes. Over the last 3 years, Caroline has worked with NGOs, public and private sector clients around the world on supporting a shift towards hybrid work and thriving in the context of the future of work. Welcome to the podcast, Caroline.
Thanks so much, Mary. Great to be here.
Well, I want to start with an article that you wrote back in December where you talked about this being a time of paradox. Can you discuss what you meant by that? And is this still the case today as we head into the early parts of 2023?
Sure. Yes, that's right. In December, I took some time to try to write and basically think with my fingers, if you like, to try to put together some ideas in terms of what I was observing with our organizational clients. And so this is a piece called WTF is Going On, which seemed to have gone viral because many people seem to relate to just the weirdness in the air that I was trying to put my finger on. So I started off exactly as you indicate, talking about paradox, because it struck me as so intriguing that on the one hand, for example, people would say that they're exhausted, and yet we're having trouble sleeping in record numbers. Folks are feeling really craving connection, want to go out. But on the other hand, when you get social gatherings, you notice people are quick to want to go home and go back to our safe cocoons. On the one hand, travel and concerts are hitting record numbers. But on the other hand, many people feel concerned and unsafe about going back to the workplace. And so I just thought it was an interesting way to try to frame some of the ambiguity and turbulence we're all experiencing, which I think absolutely to your question is still going on.
Well, you really hit the nail on the head because that's certainly a feeling that I've experienced myself. In that same article, you talk about the psychological, social, and technological impacts that individuals are feeling right now, as well as how this shows up in organizations. Perhaps you could explain this to our audience.
Sure. So I should say I'm certainly not a mental health practitioner, but I am a practitioner working in organizational change and leadership and communication. So that's sort of the lens that I look at some of these things on. And yes, I'd identified these sort of three main buckets of challenges that we're facing. So the first is psychological. I think realistically, everyone has experienced such profound trauma and turbulence caused by the disorientation of the pandemic that this has caused us to be basically bathing in anxiety. And you get this sense that we're in a fight, flight, or freeze mode, which of course is very much transferring into the workplace where you've got stressed out, fatigued, overloaded people bumping up against each other in all kinds of ways, which we're experiencing in issues like burnout and organizational conflict. Socially, by extension, we've also got this feeling of being unmoored, and we've sort of lost the basic parameters and guideposts in our life. When you think about it, even basic things like what is a school? What is a church? What is work? All of these things have sort of vaporized and are being reimagined in ways that we haven't yet quite caught up to socially. So again, that's leading to a lot of feeling unmoored, anxiety, and sort of a turbulence that is proving to be quite exhausting. I think the technological aspect is quite interesting, and if anything, becomes an accelerator of the first two, which is that we are in what has often been called the hyperactive hive mind. It's the most information-saturated era in the history of mankind. And again, our brains have just not adapted to this onslaught and bombardment of information. And so what we notice is that people have this sort of fight, flight, freeze mentality that has been charged up with technology. And so we have a feeling that a red dot on our phone is commanding our attention constantly. People are getting Slack messages all the time at work. And at the other end of the spectrum are having difficulty concentrating and really doing the kind of deep work that many of us crave in terms of having a satisfying experience at work, particularly among our not-for-profit clients who have a real sense of purpose and mission in the work that they're doing, and yet find that they're just struggling to do what their heart wants them to be able to do, which I think is really explained at that sort of psychological, social, and technology aspect, as opposed to being an individual failing.
And how should nonprofit leaders address these issues as they appear in their organizations? What can they do to empathetically support their staff who are still being impacted by the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic and other world events?
Absolutely. So I think you've got exactly the right idea. It is about empathy, but in many respects it's also a question of balancing accountability with empathy. And I think that's where a lot of leaders struggle, that they have been reluctant to set out guidelines and expectations because they fear a backlash and they don't want to say something that people won't like. And of course, this is what we're very much experiencing with conversations around return to the office. But, ultimately, clarity is kind and people are craving clarity. And so, what we're finding among our practices, those organizations that have had the guts and the discipline to figure out what are the rules of engagement, which could be many different things. Some clients have gone totally digital by default, others are mandatory in office, and most are somewhere in between, that immediately drops down the level of chaos and turbulence in organizations. The other piece around this is the sense of agency, because change communication is ultimately very much about respect, and people need to have a sense of agency. So it's totally appropriate that people can say, okay, this employer has gone, for example, totally remote. I don't like that. I enjoyed the community in the office, so I retain a sense of agency that perhaps this is no longer where I want to work. And the converse is also true among the other end of the spectrum. So I really encourage organizations to minimize this period of uncertainty, because we know that humans do best with good news. They do badly with bad news, but they do worst of all with no news at all. And this period of protracted uncertainty is, I think, causing a lot of harm.
And are there any other trends that you're seeing in terms of how workplaces are impacting the mental health of their staff, or the changes in the workplace are impacting their mental health? What are organizations getting wrong?
That's a really interesting point. So, one of the main areas that I think organizations are getting wrong is onboarding. And what we find is that the patterns of disengagement and mental health difficulty tends to be exacerbated by those employees that were onboarded during the pandemic. And I've seen, frankly, lots of heartbreaking stories of extremely talented people that are excited about a new job, but they're plunked in their living rooms. They have no sense of connection. Nobody's checking in on them, and they really don't know how this machine works. And so this is a terrible thing because, racehorses need to race. People want to do their best work. Again, we find this especially in purpose-driven organizations in the not-for-profit sector. And then it's paralyzing, it's demoralizing, and it really causes tremendous pain when we look at people that don't have appropriate support. So I think in terms of what organizations are doing wrong, that's a big ticket item, is onboarding. The other is the sense of community. And I really think that community should be used as the instrument of change. When we think about it, humans crave connection and community. We're hardwired for this. And yet we tend to be in a very siloed, fragmented way of operating that's really missing the mark in terms of a sense of community. So a simple example would be you see organizations invest a lot in town hall meetings, often online, which are organized in the old school fashion of a bunch of executives talking at their staff, which is totally a missed opportunity for exactly what employees need and crave, not just at the head level, but at the heart. And so just simple shifts like having on-ramps for conversation, having that sense of community, whether it's the employer or whether it's a particular department or a particular project community, that I think is the most exciting instrument for change that is probably especially relevant in the not-for-profit sector.
And do you think that this is a sort of a continued time of disruption for organizations and their employees? I mean, we certainly we keep waiting for the end of the pandemic, and we're and really, there seems to be a lot of self-delusion, I guess I would say. But how does that reflect in our workplaces, and what does it mean for nonprofit leaders? What do they need to do to support a good workplace mental health, in particular in these times when, clearly there's still a concern and a potential impact of COVID, but at the same time we're all sort of just fed up and we're entering our normal life, or trying to, as you say, still with a sense of dread and fear.
Absolutely. So again, this is interesting that I think if we look at its essence, the pace of change has outpaced our ability to absorb it. That's really why we're in a collective experience of exhaustion and disorientation because of that disconnect. So for one thing, I always start with the Hippocratic oath of first do no harm. If your people are change overloaded, and I think most humans on earth are, then let's not worsen that problem by piling on all kinds of other changes. And this is where I find some executives are so enthusiastic of all kinds of good ideas that they just keep piling more things on top of one another, technology improvements, process engineering, and what have you. And that has outpaced the ability of the organization and the individuals to absorb change. So for one thing, I would be extremely attentive to change capacity, and certainly start off by not digging when you're already in a hole in terms of this problem of change fatigue. The other is, I think, in terms of trying to move from information dissemination to sense making. And this is an interesting pattern that I'm seeing among our clients, that when people are disoriented and confused, they just keep piling more and more words onto them to try to fill that void from a communication perspective. And again, they're just making things worse because now it's clutter. People are bombarded. They're checking their emails on average 36 times an hour, and they're kind of drowning. So again, that's unhelpful. I have found that the single best way to get people to better understand and navigate change is through conversation, because that's the way as humans we make sense of things, is by having a conversation. And what is fascinating to me is even among executives who have spent hundreds of hours working together, say, for example, on a hybrid model, when you start to ask, okay, well, what do you mean by a hybrid model? Or what do you mean by the future of work? You start finding that people have multiple different definitions, which tend to be colored by their professional lens. So the IT people think it's all about IT, the accountants think it's all about accounting, and nobody is seeing the whole for the sum of its parts. So I really think that the prescription that is the easiest and the most high impact is to have on-ramps for conversations so that employees can collectively make sense of these new ways of working, and that we've got some time to metabolize that.
Many organizations are rethinking their approach to work, as you know, certainly from your experience of the last 3 years working with so many different kinds of organizations and companies, either by continuing with remote work or bringing back people into the office or developing some form of hybrid work environment. And some haven't yet decided what their future is going to hold, or what they're going to stay with as a policy. How are these changes impacting the mental health of staff? And what should leaders be aware of, especially if they're adopting a new or different way of working for their organization?
Yes, that's such a great point, because I think, there's lots of evidence to show that people are not okay. Our employees are often not okay, or their family members are not okay. And so that's something that I am struck with, because we tend to think about organizational change or organizational communication, but of course we're dealing with humans, and change is always experienced at a personal level. So I think, first of all, some of the basic matters of hygiene are check-ins, to reach out. We know that there's an epidemic of loneliness. We have employees that are working in remote settings, some of them living alone, who are craving connection and need to feel seen and feel heard. And so that's one of the most important things, is to have that opportunity for check-in and individual conversations in terms of how people are navigating change, and to be attentive to the fact that even if the employee is performing reasonably well, they're almost certainly dealing with children in mental health crises or elder care problems, or they can't get in to see a doctor. So there are all of these systemic issues around us which invariably affect the workplace. So we come back to these basics of check-ins, of empathy, and also of clarity. And so making sure that people are set up to succeed. And this is what I find is really lacking, and yet is certainly within the grasp of leadership, is to identify, okay, what is the expectation? Do we have clear processes? Do people know how to get things done around here? And if not, how can we make this easier on them? And then I would wrap all that with this idea of community. How do we really build communities? Because people are craving that. And I notice even in my in-person workshops, the energy in the room shifts quite dramatically. People start off and are often quite uncomfortable. We have lost our guardrails here. We don't know how to behave. So again, clarity is kind. Tell people if they're coming into the office, how is it going to work? What is expected? What is the process? If they're going to a meeting, what time does it start? What are the materials? What is the objective? So that people have a sense of confidence that they start to navigate these new norms. It's exhausting. So I will say also that in my experience, people no longer tolerate a full, intensive, immersive, full-day program. We now convert our sessions that we do, workshops or retreats, from 9:30 to 3:30, and we insist on breaks. We insist on no programming over lunch, because even just the brains having to figure out, where do I sit? Do I shake hands? I may never have met these colleagues. Do I call him Mr. or do I call him Bob? All of these things are extremely demanding to employees. And so we need to make sure that they have breathing room and some time to adapt. So those are some of the guidelines that I would recommend based on what we're seeing.
Well, much of the focus of your work is on communications, and you've talked a bit about the importance of communications and the kindness of being clear in communications. But how does communication by leadership, or the lack of it, impact workplace mental health? Maybe you can do a deeper dive there, and maybe offer any tips that you can for nonprofit leaders to make improvements.
Yes, that's a really great point. So I think in essence, what we want is to look at, what does high performance organizational communication look like? And ideally, I think of it in terms of different wheels in a sort of a flywheel effect. So you've got that leadership communication, which is key in terms of setting the direction. Now, the heaviest lift happens from managers, middle managers, because we know that the most used and the most trusted channel of communication is one's immediate supervisor. And then some organizations have a lot of communication coming from HR, or may have a dedicated internal communication practice. But the key here is that change communications can't just be punted over to internal communication, because of course, no organization has a communications team large enough for that role. And so the magic is really in the middle, is how do executive leaders set the expectation and then support management delivery and development of core competencies in communications and change, such that they are well tooled up for the task. And that is, I think, probably what's missing most often. What I'm seeing is leaders who are keen to communicate. Of course, some aren't, but generally speaking, by the time one gets to a CEO role, one has got the memo that communicating is part of the job. We've got very high-performing internal communication teams, but generally the largest band is really in terms of middle management. And frankly, lots of folks get promoted due to functional expertise, like they're a lawyer or they're a software engineer or what have you, but may lack that sensitivity to what it's like to really lead through communication. So that's where, if I had $1 to invest in organizational communications, that's where I would invest. I would also start with clarity of intent and messaging. What I find, and that's probably symptomatic of this sort of twitchy era that we're in, people will say, oh, we're doing a return to office. Quick, send us all staff email, do a meeting, do a thing. And then my counsel is always to slow down in order to speed up. So if we're saying we're doing a return to office or we're doing new ways of working or whatever the phrase is, do we have a crisp, muscular statement of intent as to what we mean? And is that message clear? And so, one of the easiest tips that I would offer leaders is to use the think, feel, do model. So, before sending an all staff email or before showing up to a town hall, take that pause, slow down in order to speed up and figure out, okay, what is it that I want my employees to think, feel, and do? And of course, underneath all that is clarity of intent. Is it really clear what you mean? Because you would be amazed that people who use phrases like hybrid or return to office or flexible, that may mean a lot of different things to different people. And so we come back to the idea that clarity is kind. Take the time to make sure that these things are clear and be attentive not only to change communications to the head, but more importantly to the heart, because people feel change. It's not an intellectual exercise.
And in your opinion, what are the markers of a workplace culture that fosters a good mental health and well-being for their employees?
That's a really insightful question. I think the key tell in my mind is trust, because really trust is a precondition of collaboration and communication. And when I go into a low trust organization, that's when I'm bound to find problems like employee absenteeism, conflict in the workplace, even violence in the workplace we've encountered. That is really the indicator of performance. And so I would really dial down on that key foundation of trust. Other key markers are a culture of empathy and caring. And so, what evidence do we have that this is a place that cares about its employees? And is that not just words, but is it felt in actions? And then to have strong leadership that is not only clear in expectation, but that has the guts to listen. And so when I speak about communication, of course, I'm speaking about, yes, putting out information and ideas, but also critically an organizational capacity and commitment to listening. So those would be some of the key indicators that I would point to.
And as we wrap this up, do you have any final tips for nonprofit leaders? If there was one thing leaders could start with today to promote better workplace mental health in their organization, what might it be?
Right. That's a good question. Again, I'm looking at this from a communications and change lens. And from that perspective, it would be to build on ramps for conversation. People need to make sense of this ambiguous, disrupted world. And the best way to do that, the hardest working tactic, is conversations. So, can you have coffee chats? Can you do town halls? Can you do road shows? Can you encourage bilateral meetings? Multiple different forms of on-ramps, could be ideally in person or it could be online, even digital platforms.
Well, Carolyn, thank you for sharing your really fascinating insights and deep understanding of the challenges and solutions with our audience of nonprofit professionals. It's greatly appreciated. Thanks for joining us on Charity Village Connects.
Thanks so much, Mary.